Let's talk about what we are seeing with our own eyes unfolding in Portland, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So I wanted to take some time before talking about what's happening out in Portland. I wanted to have a clear-eyed view as best I could of what in the world the feds are doing out there. So let me start with this. As a prosecutor for 30 years, first in the Army and then with the Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Columbia, I have worked with more law enforcement agencies than I can count. I mean, whether it's the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, the U.S. Park Police, the U.S. Capitol Police, the U.S. Secret Service Uniform Division, the U.S. Marshal Service, the Federal Protective Service, whether it's the Amtrak Police, the Postal Police, the Metro Police, the Smithsonian Police, whether it's the Military Police, MPI, Military Police Investigators, CID, the Military's Criminal Investigation Division, NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Services. I could go on and on. There are a lot of law enforcement agencies, and there are so many different varied federal law enforcement agencies. It's not unusual for federal law enforcement agencies and local, state, city law enforcement agencies to work together. And when done right, take it from me, it can be really effective. I say take it from me because as a prosecutor, I was the point person assigned to such a joint task force. It was a joint task force in the 90s that consisted of the FBI, the Washington Field Office in DC, and the city police, the Metropolitan Police Department. Those two agencies were partnered together in what was called the Cold Case Task Force. And what we did was we worked to solve old, cold murders in Washington, D.C. And it was a joint task force, federal and city, that worked extraordinarily well. So when the feds are invited into a city or a local jurisdiction to participate in a joint operation, it can work extremely well. But when they're not invited in, we can now see that it can be a disaster. Now, first of all, the feds don't have to be invited into a city to do some of what they are entitled to do. For instance, the Federal Protective Service, FPS, that is an agency under Homeland Security, right? And Homeland Security has lots of different components, law enforcement components to it. It has ICE, right? Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It has CBP, Customs and Border Protection. It has FPS, Federal Protective Service. Let's talk about FPS. FPS, their jurisdiction, its jurisdiction, is to protect federal properties, federal buildings. For example, the federal courthouse in Portland. FPS's jurisdiction is the federal courthouse and what we call the curtilage, basically the area immediately adjacent to the courthouse. And I mean, that means the sidewalks and maybe halfway across the adjacent street. But they can't run into a McDonald's across the street and enforce law over there because FPS doesn't have jurisdiction to do that. But they do have jurisdiction to protect federal properties and federal buildings. So what have we seen in Portland? We have seen that when the federal law enforcement agencies stray from their jurisdiction, uninvited by the state, it can have disastrous consequences. They can violate the First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom to assemble of the protesters. They can violate the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment protects citizens against unreasonable searches and seizures, arrests. They can violate the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. The 10th Amendment says the federal government's powers are few and enumerated, and the powers and the rights left to the states and the people are unlimited. So they can violate any number of constitutional provisions when federal law enforcement comes in uninvited and begins trying to overstep their bounds or enforce the local laws. They can violate the civil rights of the protesters. They can violate the criminal law. For example, the law of assault. Let's take a look at one example that we have seen with our own eyes of what federal law enforcement agents did to Navy veteran Chris David.
And this disturbing video shows the agents beating a Navy veteran with batons and then dousing him with pepper spray when he says that he was trying to engage them in a civil conversation.
That was Navy veteran Chris David. I saw it with my own eyes. You saw it with your own eyes. But before we leap to any conclusions, let's talk to the victim. Let's talk to Chris David and see what his experience was outside that courthouse in Portland.
That it was okay what they were doing, that I felt that they were violating their oath to the Constitution. And so what I did in preparation for that, I put on my Naval Academy sweatshirt, my Navy wrestling hat, and my backpack with all my CB patches, under the presumption that they would respect that and maybe talk to me instead of treat me as some other protester. That didn't work out at all.
That didn't work out at all. Perhaps an understatement? They smashed Chris David's hand, fracturing it in multiple places, and he is now awaiting surgery. You know, for 30 years as a prosecutor, I evaluated evidence and tried to decide whether that evidence supported a criminal charge. We saw what happened outside that courthouse in Portland. We've now heard from the victim, Chris David. I can tell you, folks, what we saw was a criminal assault. I saw it with my own eyes. You saw it with your own eyes, as did Acting Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Ken Cuccinelli. Let's see what Cuccinelli has to say about what he saw with his own eyes.
What you have there is Marshal Service folks. You don't have DHS officers. I'm familiar with the video you're talking about. All I have is the video that I've seen. I haven't seen either the audio or the reports of officers of what was going on. But
based on what you see,
based on what you see in that video, just based on what you see, is that unusually threatening? No. I don't base things on one. The reason we came there wasn't because of some future video. The reason we advanced other DHS law enforcement officers is because there was intelligence locally generated that there were going to be threats to federal facilities. Maintaining an appropriate response is an ongoing obligation. I grant you that, and that's for all of us. But at the same time, the threat to those federal facilities and officers did materialize.
So Ken Cuccinelli first says, well, that wasn't DHS. That was some other agency. I would suggest that is a tacit admission, an implicit admission of wrongdoing, because he couldn't defend the conduct. Instead, he had to try to shift blame to another agency. Then he goes on to say, well, we had threats, credible threats that federal properties were going to be damaged. So, basically we had to do what we had to do. Well, you know what, Cuccinelli? You don't get to preemptively beat the citizenry who are protesting, who are assembling, who are exercising their First Amendment rights because there may be a future threat to federal property. Yeah, I'm angry. But let's see how the victim, Chris David, responds to what Ken Cuccinelli tries to spin after he sees that video clip.
What is your response to Cuccinelli?
Oh, that's a difficult one. Ken Cuccinelli cannot see what is obvious to millions of other people.
Which is?
And, well, that I was standing there peacefully and then they beat me for pretty much no reason. Now, I understand the pickle that he is in. He cannot say, yeah, that was inappropriate. Almost everybody else in the United States can.
Almost everyone else in the United States can see that what those federal officers did to Chris David was wrong. I can see it. You can see it. The question is, what do we do about it? I've heard some talk recently of some of the state officials saying, well, if the feds come into my state, we're going to lock them up. We're going to have the local police officers lock up the federal police officers. Can I suggest that that would be playing right into Trump and Bill Barr's hands, and that would escalate the situation? I say flood the courts. Use the court system in all 50 states. Get the judges on your side. When I say get the judges on your side, I don't mean that the judges will, select a side. They will be on the side of the law. And right now, the people are on the side of the law. The protesters are on the side of the law. The states, the governors, the city officials are on the side of the law, and Trump and Bill Barr are violating the law. They're violating the people's right to assemble. They're violating the criminal laws by assaulting the protesters. They're violating the 10th Amendment by overstepping their federal bounds, and they're violating the sovereign rights of the states. So flood the courts, get the judges on your side, get temporary restraining orders, get injunctions. That, in the long run, is the way to combat federal lawlessness, not an eye for an eye. Not if the feds are going to overstep their bounds and ratchet up the violence. We're going to respond in kind by trying to lock them up. That will not end well. And most importantly, what we do, folks, no surprise, is we get out and vote in numbers too big to rig. And then come January, we begin holding these folks accountable, the Trumps, the Barrs, the Cuccinellis, for what they have been doing to the people instead of supporting the people. Stay safe, folks. I look forward to talking to you again soon.